Hello, everybody, and welcome to the National Invasive Species Awareness Week, powered by the North American Invasive Species Management Association. My name is Tricia Bethke, and I'm the Forest Pest Outreach Coordinator for the state of Illinois. I am delighted to have you with us today for the fifth and final webinar in the 2021 NISAW Part 2 series. NISAW is an international event to raise awareness about invasive species, the threat that they pose, and what we can do to prevent their spread. Representatives from local, state, federal, and regional organizations normally gather with non-governmental organizations and industries to discuss legislation, policy, and improvements that can be made to prevent and manage invasive species. We are concluding an outstanding week of daily webinars today. Before we begin today's presentation, please allow me a moment to share a little bit about NISAW with those of you that don't know us well. Our mission is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America. What we do, we promote international standards for mapping and certified weed-free products. We provide education and advocacy during the National Invasive Species Awareness Week. We have a fantastic outreach and awareness program. Play Clean Go, the national program, will be celebrated June 6th through the 12th. Please check our website for more information on that. Additionally, we do provide professional development, certification programs, webinars and trainings, and our annual conference that's coming up. Save the date, please join us September 27th through the 30th, 2021 in Missoula, Montana. We're really looking forward to this conference. Please check out our website at NISAW.org for more information. If you are not a member, I encourage you to join us because there's a lot of great benefits. We have a student member, professional, and a sustaining member. There's lots of great opportunities for education, resource tools, a quarterly newsletter, and regular communications about invasive species. My favorite part of being a member is the NISAW First Fridays. You can join us for virtual networking, members only. The next networking get-together will be June 4th at 2 p.m. on Central Standard Time. The topic that we are going to be talking about is public education and outreach efforts. Our mission is to support, promote, and empower invasive species prevention and management in North America. Now let's get right to the main event. I'm super excited for today's webinar and to introduce our speakers, Dr. Jacob Barney with Virginia Tech and Slade Franklin from the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. Please be sure to put your questions in the Q&A box. We will hold all questions for both speakers until after the presentations. Again, please put the questions in the Q&A box and not the chat box so we can be sure to answer everybody's questions after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the NISAW public YouTube channel within a week. And with that, I would like to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Jacob Barney, Associate Professor, Invasive Plant Ecology, School of Plant and Environmental Sciences at Virginia Tech. Dr. Jacob Barney received his Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry from the University of Kentucky and then received his Master's of Science and PhD from Cornell University in weed ecology. He then moved to the University of California, Davis as a postdoctoral scholar before beginning his position in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech in 2010. Dr. Barney works on the causes, consequences, and epidemiology of invasive species to develop innovative mitigation strategies to this element of global change. Dr. Barney works in a variety of natural and managed ecosystems across the United States and has projects on both emerging and long-standing invasive species. Current projects include determining the ecological impact of invasive species in natural systems, interaction of propagule pressure, species trait, receiving habitat characters determining invasion successes, evaluating the role of local adaptation and phenotypical plasticity in range expansion, and the role of epigenetics in stress tolerance. Dr. Barney has research programs in a variety of systems, including deciduous forests, reclaimed coal mines, riparian systems, and agroecosystems. Dr. Barney has published 91 peer-reviewed papers, 1 book, 6 chapters, 4 policy documents, 3 extension publications, and has given 32 invited and 113 contributed presentations. We are absolutely delighted that Dr. Barney can join us today. So with that, I am going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn off my video. And Dr. Barney, if you could, excellent.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here today to share some of the work that some colleagues and I have recently been working on. We're all members of the Virginia Tech Invasive Species Working Group, and we have a variety of foci at the working group, but one of which is the interface of science and policy. And this presentation is going to share some of the work that we did with respect to the state of noxious weed lists across the United States. And the motivation for this work are many. We all know that there are many invasive species already across the United States, but we're going to be facing a weedier world, unfortunately. This is a recent study showing the number of first introductions as a function of time for a wide number of taxonomic groups. And you can see for most of these panels, the line is increasing with time. And this suggests that as time goes on, we will not only be facing the current suite of invasive species, but new ones on an annual basis. And the reasons that we care about these species are obvious to all of you, I'm sure. It's the impacts they cause, both ecological, economic, and to human health. And here's, this is a common sight, at least in the eastern United States, of a dominant invasive species on the forest understory that has consequences for succession, trophic interactions, and nutrient cycles. There's recent evidence suggesting that the terrible wildfires that have been occurring in the West can at least be partially attributed to the dominance of invasive grasses in the West. So there's an immediate infrastructure, human, and environmental consequence to this invasion. And then there's much more sort of minutia details about the consequences of invasion. This is reflective of a meta-analysis from about 10 years ago showing the effects of invasive plant species on native plants at the top and native animals on the bottom, with most of those bars to the left of 0 showing reductions in plant and animal health and fitness. And of course, the economic consequences, these are always very difficult to estimate. You're probably all familiar with the study from about 20 years ago. There was a really recent one that just came out a couple weeks ago from a group out of France, estimating the economic consequences of invasive species as over $1 trillion, with it increasing annually. So the consequences of these species are dramatic and ongoing. And we as managers and researchers were sort of left with two opportunities to mitigate the consequences of invasive plants. You sort of bin these into 2 big categories. The first would be pre-introduction or prevention. This is obviously what many of us would prefer, is to prevent the introduction of possibly future invasive species. This has dramatic economic benefits, it's very efficient, etc. But we're often left with the latter category, where it's very difficult to predict invasion, or they just get in through some means. And we have to set management priorities, allocating scarce resources. And one tool that we have available to us to mitigate the spread and impact of invasive plants is noxious weed lists, which is of course the focus of my talk. There's a brief timeline showing the sort of history that the US government has with respect to preventing or limiting weeding invasive plants. This is not comprehensive, it's just sort of the highlights, but I did wanted to show it because it dates back for over a century that we've been thinking about and understanding the consequences of these species and wanting to mitigate them. Of course, the Plant Quarantine Act, about a half century later with the Federal Plant Pest Act, the Federal Noxious Weed Act, of course, the executive order from '99 that established the National Invasive Species Council and its associated advisory committee, and then the Plant Protection Act. These all had various actions and activities with respect to preventing invasion, limiting invasion, and one outcome of this was the creation of a noxious weed list. Here, this is the federal list. So as a country, we maintain a list of species that are identified as those that are not allowed importation into the country, except under very extenuating circumstances, and they shouldn't be moved around the country. So these are sort of the who's who of who's not allowed into the United States. And At present, this encompasses a little over 100 individual species and 5 total genera. Now, this isn't limited to the federal government, of course. Individual states have the opportunity to create their own set of noxious weed regulations. And this is a study from 20 plus years ago that was designed as sort of one of the earlier sort of comprehensive evaluations of which species are listed across the whole US, and they also included Canada. Now, this particular analysis was designed to identify which species are or should be targeted for biocontrol. So the thought here was the more states that list a species as noxious suggests that it's probably pretty problematic and worthy of a biological control effort. But there's a few things I want to share with you here. The first is that if you look at the map on the left, there are a number of states, in fact, 16 US states that in the year 2000 did not have any noxious weed lists whatsoever. And so there was only 34 states that had them. And you can see the different shading of individual states, and that reflects 2 different types of lists that I will not focus on detail here. But there's a simple list and a more nuanced tiered list, and we can talk about that later if that's of interest. But what this group did is they combined all the species. They found that there was a little over 500 total species listed, including Canada, and that these were the top 6 most listed species that, for the purposes of this analysis, they were suggesting should be the target of biocontrol. About 10 years later, in 2013, some colleagues and I took a little different approach to evaluating noxious weed lists. Our question was, do state-listed noxious weed, again, these are regulated species, how well do they match the list of species that are considered invasive in that same geography? Now, these are often maintained by different entities. Noxious weed lists are often maintained by some state agency, often the Department of Ag, but not always. Whereas invasive plant lists are often non-regulated lists of species, either created by some other state agency or more commonly by a third party that has a focus on invasive species. And the short story is here that the individual states did not well represent or did not include many species that were considered invasive in those particular geographies. So there wasn't much overlap. It could be for a variety of reasons. We speculated that it could be because the historical evolution of noxious weed lists were protecting agriculture, and also these lists move quite slowly. It's a political process, so maybe they just haven't caught up. But more recently, as part of the working group here at Virginia Tech, we've been interested in sort of updating this evaluation in our effort to understand science policy interactions at the invasive species context. And so we had two big questions. There's some nuances here, but to what extent could we identify that states are working together, coordinating, listing species together in a way that is proactive? In other words, are many states listing species for regulation that are not yet there or widespread? So let me take you through how we did that. So the first thing that we did was we downloaded all of the current noxious weed lists that are maintained by the National Plant Board. This was as of about a year ago. We cross-referenced all of the individually listed species with this database of taxonomy. We then extracted information about each species with respect to their life history and their nativity. And we evaluated nativity at the country scale because information with respect to state level nativity, there's not a central database that we were aware of that's comprehensive and thorough. So just consider here that nativity is at the country scale. And we also downloaded all of the information with respect to the geographic extent of these species using the bison database. So which states did each species occur in? We removed every species that was considered a federal noxious weed. And this was because these are already listed at the federal level, which means they're regulated in all 50 states. So we wanted to exclusively include species that were uniquely listed by individual states. We created a large relational database. And one decision we had to make that will be critical for interpreting our results is that there were a shockingly high number of entire genera that were listed. As you can see here, I've got parenthetically, one state listed Rubus SPP. And so we had to make a decision about what do we do about that. Rubus is a large genus, and we didn't have any idea what the motivation was for each state listing a genus. So we took a more conservative approach and included all species within a genus. And There's some limitations to that, of course, but our assumption was that as a policymaker was interpreting which species were included in the list, by our interpretation, any species in that genus would be included. So keep that in mind because that's an important point. Okay, here's a sort of state of the noxious union. By the year 2020, so this is 20 years updated from that previous analysis, there are now 46 states that maintain a list of regulated species. There's over 3,000 total listings and over 1,200 individual species that are listed. This is about 2.5 times the number of listed species from just 20 years ago. So there's a huge expansion in a short amount of time. Here are the 4 states that did not have any list, at least according to the National Plant Board. So as of now, these 4 states still do not have a noxious weed list that we could tell. There were 2 states, Rhode Island and Georgia, that only listed species that were on the federal noxious weed list. So they didn't have anything unique to their state. On average, states listed 75 species, with the grand winner of Oklahoma here. They had over 300 listed species, but there should be an asterisk here because they also listed the most number of total genera. So here's a spatial distribution of what the non-federal noxious weed state listed species are across the United States. A couple things I want to point out is that there's huge variation in the number of species that are regulated across the US. There's no obvious pattern or geographic element to this. The West tends to list a lot of species, the sort of middle prairie states, relatively fewer, the middle South, fewer, but it sort of is all over the board. There's no clear spatial pattern to this. This is a list of the 10 states that had the largest list, and the colors correspond to nativity that I'll explain in a second. And parenthetically, next to each state is the total number of genera that were listed by each state. And you can see that Oklahoma listed 7 entire genera. So again, this has a pretty profound impact on interpreting our results here, but so be it. Okay, so we also broke down the nativity of each species based on the references I mentioned before. And we broke them down to 3 basic categories. The first is it's introduced to the United States, so it's not native to the US. The second is that it's native to somewhere in the United States. And lastly, that it has never occurred here in the US, at least based on the resources that we could identify. And we broke these down by life history that I'll share now. Shouldn't be too many terribly big surprises here. You'll see that perennials dominate the life history of most listed species. This tracks with sort of the theory in invasion biology that perennials are often the most problematic. Well, this is reflected in the species that are regulated. Life form, the forbs are the most commonly listed, with trees being very few among all states. There's some nuances here with respect to the families. So for the introduced species, the Asteraceae and Poaceae, probably not a terrible surprise here. Those are the most commonly listed families. Okay, so now I want to transition to discussing proactivity here. And the way that we're defining proactivity is how many species is each state listing that is not yet occurring in that state. So it may occur somewhere else in the United States, but how many don't occur there yet? So again, this is how we're defining proactivity. So you can see by looking at this map, and the color shading reflects the proportion of the list that is proactive. So you see lots of zeros there. So there are a pretty decent handful of states that are only listing, either they have no list whatsoever, or they're only listing species that are already in that state. So we would consider that fairly reactive. And there's of course Oklahoma, which is the outlier because of all those genera, which lists lots of species that are not yet in the state. But by and large, the shading on many of these states is relatively small. There's some states that are doing a really good job and others that are a little bit more modest. But overall, these lists tend to be fairly reactive. And if we scale that back out a little bit and to look at the what is occurring in the United States, so these are species that are listed on a state list that do not occur in the United States at all. And we would predict these to be relatively smaller numbers than the previous slide, but there are several states here that are doing pretty proactive jobs as far as listing species that are not yet in the US, which, there may be some state-federal interactions there that would be interesting to work out. But again, there's a decent bit of proactivity here with respect to country level. So there are a handful of really interesting nuances here that I thought would be interesting to share with you that have to do with sort of asterisks or sidebars as you look through individual states lists. And we've broken these down into big categories here, but there's some really difficult ones to maybe interpret. Like if you look at cultivars there in the middle, you see that New York lists all cultivars, where in some states have exceptions. Sometimes states list specific cultivars. Nativeness is something that comes up and I'll return to in a minute. So for example, you're probably all familiar that Phragmites has both a native and a non-native form. And in some cases, states called out that only the non-native should be regulated and listed. From the agricultural category there were some states that had to make sort of interesting exceptions. So you see like Daucus carota there, and that's the same species for wild carrot and cultivated carrot. And they're saying, well, that species should be regulated except when it's commercially grown, basically the carrots that we eat. My favorite here though is from Washington in the history category here, that tamarix is regulated except for those populations that were planted prior to 2004. I have no idea why this is, what it is about 2004, how you would possibly tell if you walked up to a population, what age it was planted. So again, this is the sort of nuances that we can't tell, but it would be interesting to have a follow-up analysis. Okay, so do these lists cluster spatially? In other words, do states that are close together have similar lists, which would be an indication that they're coordinating? Not at all. There's no indication whatsoever that there's any sort of, again, only based on the list, there might be coordination going on that we're not aware of, but based on our analysis, states do not share much of their lists. In other words, it appears states are doing their own thing. Now, if you contrast that with what weeds exist in each state, we get a clear pattern that makes a ton of sense. So this map shows you that the weedy flora of these states are shared in these sort of big categories. So the subtropical places of Florida and Hawaii share. California's doing its own thing because it's Mediterranean. And so again, this map makes a lot of sense. And so we would have predicted that if the list had been reflective of the weedy flora, it would have a pattern more similar to this, but that's in fact not what we found. Here is a list of the top 10 most listed species. There's a lot of familiarity here, some redundancy with what they found 20 years ago. But what I really wanted to point out here is that these are species that were introduced forever ago, 200, 300 years ago. And there's a couple ways to think about that. One is that it takes a long time for species to become problematic, which is true. However, it also may suggest that we are listing things after the fact. They've already become common, they've become widespread. So the effectiveness as a listing tool may be less than focusing on species that are not yet widespread. So sort of keep that in mind. A couple surprises here. Lots of native species, of course, like we mentioned. There were 80% of states listed at least one native. There were almost half the states listed at least one genera. There were 41 total genera listed, comprising over 700 species. Half of those are native, and many of those genera contained crops. Like there were some examples where brassica was listed as a noxious weed. So that includes basically kale, broccoli, cauliflower, etc. How that's managed at the state level, we don't have any idea, but it does have that interesting consequence. So let me just sort of tie this all together here. We found that there does not appear to be much consistency among adjacent states. It seems that the majority of lists as of right now seem fairly reactive, listing species after they're already present. And there's this, tons of native species, lots of whole genera that are being listed that includes crops. And so what do we recommend here? So a couple things. One, the listing entire genera seems quizzical. I'm sure there are reasons at the state level that we just couldn't parse through this analysis, but it seems to be, there has to be a better way to do this. And we would advocate for removing entire genera except where there's really intentional reasons for that. The nativity of species is going to become a little bit of a tricky situation here with time as climate change causes species to move around. Things that were historically native one place are going to be moving other places. So this is something to think about in the future. Coordination, coordination, coordination. This is probably my top take home. It would be great if states were regionally coordinating that share ecoregions, climates, boundaries, etc. And it would be really nice if there was a national strategy for making these lists more effective, more efficient. Perhaps this is something National Invasive Species Council could lead. I don't know if that's within their purview, just giving that as an example organization. And I would advocate focusing on species that are not yet widespread. And so I'll leave you with a few caveats because obviously we couldn't cover everything here. Here's some questions that we didn't ask but certainly need answers. Is we have no idea. All we saw was a list. We don't know what the process was, what the motivation was for individual states listing species. That would be a really interesting follow-up study. This is the question I would love answered. Do these things even work? I don't have a personal good sense for how effective they are as a tool to limit spread and the impact of species. That would be a really interesting question. And if so, what structure is most effective? Because it varies tremendously across states. Do the stakeholders that need to know about these lists, do they know about them and abide by them? I don't have a sense for that at all. That would be a good social science follow-up question. And lastly, are there better approaches? I think noxious weed lists have a great place in the world, but are there perhaps better complementary approaches? I don't know. These are great questions worth thinking about. I very much appreciate your time and attention. This and what I just showed you came from this paper that we just published, and I'll be delighted to answer your questions in the chat and at the end. Thanks very much.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. Let me start my video. Gosh, that was great. I can't tell you how timely this presentation, the topic. Illinois has reconvened their Illinois Invasive Species Council, and these are some of the questions that we are addressing. So thank you very much, Dr. Barney. I will be back in touch with you. I do have many questions. You do have a few questions in the Q&A, so if you take a moment, you can answer them directly. We will have both presenters back at the end of Slade Franklin's presentation, so we can answer any questions live that we may have. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our next speaker. He is Slade Franklin, the State Weed and Pest Coordinator with the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. He is presenting the Western Weed Action Plan. Slade Franklin has been employed by the Wyoming Department of Agriculture since 1999. Since 2004, he has worked for the department as the State Weed and Pest Coordinator. His primary role is to help county weed and pest control districts in implementing effective management programs for invasive weeds and pests. He also manages several state and federal grant programs, including the Emergency Insect Management Grant, Special Management Program Grant, the USFS State and Private Forestry Noxious Weed Grant, and the State Pesticide Registration Grants. He helped the state develop an agricultural terrorism response plan and served on the Wyoming Governor Friedenthal American Recovery and Reinvestment Act working team. Slade coordinates the Wyoming Annual Grasses Task Force and the Wyoming Interagency Weed and Pest Working Group, and the Wyoming and Weed and Pest Council's annual meetings. He has served as chairman for the Western Weed Coordinating Committee and the State Weed Coordinators Alliance, and is a former member of the National Invasive Species Council Invasive Species Advisory Committee. Recently, he helped develop and publish the Western Weed Action Plan related to protecting the sagebrush biome from invasive species and Wyoming Governor Gordon's Wyoming Invasive Species Initiative report. Currently, he is serving as the Wyoming representative for the Western Invasive Species Council. It is my sincere pleasure to present the Slade Franklin's presentation.
Thank you for the invitation to speak today about the Western Weed Action Plan. My name is Slade Franklin, and I'm the Weed and Pest Coordinator with the Wyoming Department of Agriculture. I appreciate the opportunity to talk a little bit about the plan that perhaps some of you watching today were involved in. I'm also representing the Western Weed Coordinating Committee, or WWCC, today by giving this presentation. As part of the presentation, I'll share the WWCC objectives and preliminary dates for the next meeting. I'll also extend an invitation to any individual or groups interested in learning more about the action plan or helping to implement it to attend the meeting. I'll try today to talk a little bit about why the Western Weed Action Plan was needed and how it was developed. I'll cover the 4 categories within the plan and scratch the surface of a few of the primary and secondary action items identified in the report. I won't spend much time talking about the threat of invasive species in the West and the sagebrush biome. For the most part, I think everyone understands or has heard about invasive annual grasses such as cheatgrass, medusa head, and ventonata, and the impacts they have on western rangelands. Those impacts including wildfire, sage grouse, and associated species habitat degradation. Where cheatgrass was identified by the University of Wyoming botanist Avon Nelson in 1901 as being weedy, worthless as a plant and forage, and already widely distributed, it's in my opinion it wasn't until the last 25 years where wildlife managers collectively recognized the threat to rangeland habitat. Additionally, with the lack of effective management tools and consistent and aggressive funding, the growing problem was ignored. I will also note that as much as we hear about the threat of invasive annual grasses, there are many perennial invasive weeds that are also impacting the ecological systems that are important to agriculture and wildlife, including sage grouse. Sometimes we lose sight of those other species when talking about the sagebrush biome. In 2013, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Conservation Objectives team identified wildfire and the associated conversion of low to mid-elevation sagebrush habitats to invasive annual grass-dominated vegetation communities as the two primary threats to the sustainability of greater sage grouse. With the collaboration of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, or WWAP, they conducted a collaborative assessment of the fire and invasive threat challenges. The result of the assessment were identified in the 2015 WWAP Invasive Plant Management and Greater Sage Grouse Conservation Report. The report identified four major challenges and barriers that needed to be addressed. The first, information, management, and science challenges. These barriers included lack of emphasis on monitoring and survey, lack of scientific information on perennial vegetation reestablishment, inadequate invasive plant data sharing, lack of certainty for actions under a changing climate. The second was leadership, coordination, and communication challenges, which included insufficient governmental coordination, limited coordination collaboration with non-traditional stakeholders, lack of effective communication engagement with the public, low level of public awareness, and support for invasive species management. The third, policy and regulatory challenges included lack of effective and regulatory framework for invasive species management and insufficient compliance monitoring and enforcement. The final and fourth, operational capacity and program management challenges included variable management prioritizations, lack of capacity for weed management at all levels, and a lack of an effective early detection rapid response program. Based on these identified barriers, WWAP and its partners determined we needed to understand in detail these barriers and formulate a plan on addressing them. Therefore, through cooperating sponsors such as the Western Society of Weed Science and the State Weed Coordinators Alliance, a summit was organized in 2015 in Boise, Idaho to bring in state, federal, and county partners to further define and prioritize action items to mitigate the barriers defined in the 2015 WWAP report. The Andrews Center for Public Policy, located at Boise State, served as an organizational and moderating entity for the effort. Over 200 individuals from federal, state, county, and private groups attended the summit, and it generated a 52-page report of the various needs and action items for effective management of invasive species in the sagebrush biome. It should be noted that although invasive annual grasses are a significant threat to the sagebrush biome, the attendees identified other species also, such as spotted and Russian knapweed and leafy spurge, as additional significant threats, and many of the action items they identified transcend the sagebrush biome and are much more comprehensive in need. A smaller team of individuals volunteered to help compile, review, categorize, and prioritize the action items identified at the summit. The smaller team included State Department of Agriculture representatives, WWAP representatives, and federal agencies. The makeup of this team was important. Often invasive species issues are looked at from the agricultural perspective or wildlife perspective, but all too often not collectively. And the addition of federal agencies helped fill in any gap of how the action items related to federal lands. With each action item from the summit, the smaller team worked to compile them based on themes, primary action items and secondary action items. The team also discussed reasonable timelines and responsible parties for each action or sub-action, but in the end left those elements off the final report. The publishing team did not always individually agree with all of the action items identified in the final report, but instead worked to ensure the will of the summit participants was captured and not lost in the final publication. The committee made categorical changes to the 4 primary categories identified in the original 2015 WWAP report. These changes, although similar in nature, were identified as better categories based on the action items identified in the summit report. Primarily, funding was such a priority issue identified, the committee decided it had to be called out as its own category. Therefore, the four original categories being information, management, and science, leadership, coordination, and communication, policy and regulatory, program management, and operational capacity were changed to research, coordination, collaboration, and data sharing, policy and regulation, and funding. Funding was defined as Category 1 within the report due to the significant role it plays in all aspects of the 4 categories. The action items identified within the category are not only about creating new funding streams, but identifying and more efficiently using existing funding streams and partnerships to get funding on the ground where it's needed. The first action item concerns developing a map on how resources are currently allocated and used. This action item alone should be one of the highest priorities for the federal agencies under the leadership of the National Invasive Species Council. As often as land managers are asking for additional funding, we still do not know how individually or collectively the federal agencies are utilizing the funds already provided by Congress. With the passing of the John D. Dingell Jr. Conservation, Management, and Recreation Act in 2019, federal agencies are mandated to use 75% of their allocated invasive species funds for on-the-ground efforts and minimize their administrative costs to 10%. If NISC was to develop an annual report for the federal agencies identifying their funding mechanisms and how those funds are utilized, states and partners can better identify how to address action item 2 and 3. The fourth action item, and even a sub-action item of action item 2, recognizes in many situations we must work collaboratively across the fence regardless of who owns or manages the land, to identify where and how to more efficiently address these weed problems and leverage our limited federal, state, and county dollars by implementing management programs together. Policy and regulation action items cover barriers identified with NEPA and encourage finding a path forward for categorical exclusions to avoid costly time delays and policy restrictions to management. It also encourages the expansion and utilization of biocontrol agents when appropriate. Action item 3 also identifies the need for federal agencies to identify and mitigate the redundancies they have in risk assessment processes for new pesticides. This action item needs to be a priority within the Bureau of Land Management in order to expedite the addition of new herbicides to their toolbox for management of invasive annual grasses on lands they manage. Additionally, action item 5 encourages stronger participation in local management programs such as coordinated weed management areas by all agencies. This would improve the local planning and partnerships to meet mutual management goals. Category 3 identifies action items that focus on coordinated planning through sharing of data, collaborative implementation, education, and monitoring. Category 3 action items highlights the barriers to working with all impacted parties when implementing landscape-scale cross-boundary management. This category also identifies the need for Western Weed Coordinating Committee to work through the National Invasive Species Council to foster national support and recognition of the magnitude of the invasive species problem in the sagebrush biome and their leadership and support of data sharing efforts in the West. The report recognizes data sharing continues to be a struggle within the invasive species community, and our inability to openly share data from federal lands to private lands is problematic due to internal policies, limiting legislation, and sadly, lost or poor data. Partnering organizations collect invasive species data on federal lands, whether it's concerning treatments or species surveys, far too often find the data was lost somewhere between providing it and publication on comprehensive database systems. These action items target the need to correct these discrepancies so that successful data sharing and management can be the foundation for sound ecological and economical management of rangelands. Finally, Category 4 identifies the action items needed to improve our understanding and ability to be successful through research. It also supports the need for a centralized system of information on existing research and programs so land managers can make their management decisions using all existing knowledge. It also identifies the fact that we are still ignorant to all the impacts of invasive species on the sagebrush biome and what successful management and reclamation looks like. The universities and research arms of the federal agencies can help us fill these gaps. Many Western universities are actively engaged in research in the sagebrush biome, yet their results are often internalized within the academia community or are only shared within the confines of their states. Additionally, land managers often have best management practices that academia are unaware of or don't recognize because it's not peer-reviewed research or publishable. The objective of this report would be to unify both traditional research knowledge with land manager practical knowledge and make it readily available. Action item 1 also identifies the fact that we need to create a consistent matrix for information collection and reporting. As mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, one of the unique qualities of this plan and its components is that it has been endorsed by a variety of associations related to agriculture, wildlife, weed science, and weed management and government. Many of those associations and groups are listed on the slide. The Western Weed Coordinating Committee, or the WWCC, has agreed to house and maintain the action plan with the goal of making it a living document that can and should be reviewed and amended annually. The WWCC brings in state and federal agency program coordinators to give updates and discuss the current state of invasive weed management issues in the West, with emphasis on identifying solutions to those national and regional existing roadblocks. The WWCC will meet in person this December in Denver, Colorado. The link on the slide will take you to the WWCC website for more information. The WWCC would welcome any organizations such as NISAW and WSWS to help review and maintain the action items, and would support outside organizations and NISAW organizers utilizing this action plan in ongoing or future outreach efforts. With that, I'd like to thank my fellow authors of the action plan. As with any effort such as this one, it takes time and effort and often pulls individuals away from other responsibilities. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak, and as time allows, I would answer any questions.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That was a great presentation. I have a quick question. Is that the weed action plan? It's published online? You can unmute yourselves, Jacob and Slade.
Yeah, it is. It's available on the Western Weed Coordinating Committee's website. So if you do a search for it, it will come up as probably the first option that comes up. So I'll try maybe to get the link to that plan on the chat here too.
That would be great. One of the things that we'd like to do as we're looking for reconvening our team in Illinois is to take a look at that structure and see if we can utilize it. It's very good. Great presentation. Both of you, great presentations today. Great way to end NISAW Part 2. We're super excited. I do have a number of comments, questions. If you do have a question for our panelists, if you could do me a favor and put it into the Q&A right now. We do have about a few more minutes. I'm seeing a lot of well done. Thank you very much. Great presentation. I know there's some information in the chat box that's going on. Jacob, did you have a chance to answer some of these questions? It looks like there was a question on what are the 12 plants that Maine is regulating that are not in the US? Not sure if you can answer that.
No, I can't answer that specifically, but I've been trying to keep up with some of the questions. If you want to follow up with me on some of the details, I'll provide my email address and you can reach out to me via that. I don't have the database in front of me to know what the specific species are.
Great. And Mike just sent the link to the weed action plan. Thank you very much, Mike. Kelly mentioned that she thinks the legislative list reflects the desire to keep problem species that are not present out and to limit the spread of the problem species that are already present in small populations. Those invasive species already present and are out of control are rarely listed as the enforcement is deemed impractical and impossible. So any thoughts on Kelly's comment?
Well, I wonder, and I think that may actually vary state by state. And, we weren't able to evaluate the motivation for why certain species were listed. And more so, different states have different structures. I mentioned briefly that some states have a tiered approach where that may follow different guidelines like prevention. Maybe some of them are slated for eradication. We did not get into that level of detail, but I do know that there are lots of species that are super widespread that are still listed. So I think there's some really important nuances there occurring at the state level that we couldn't get into the details of for this work.
I'd maybe just answer that a little bit too from a state perspective. We do have a weed list for Wyoming, has 30 species on it. So I was a little surprised to see 0 on Wyoming there. But those lists are utilized locally too. There's a reason why some of those species are put on that list for very local reasons or policy reasons. And so, sometimes maybe when we talk about lists from a very grand scale of all the states, we lose what those important aspects of why species are added locally for a state list for those programs to, choose those over others.
That's great, thank you. Do you define noxious and invasive the same way? Pennsylvania had a list of both, and that's been a holdup in adding any of the plants to the Noxious Weed Act.
So we used the term noxious broadly as any species that is regulated by the state, whereas invasive can be also used in that context, but we were strictly using the term noxious to represent species that are listed at the state level. Invasive being a much broader category.
Okay. All right. Everything's popping in. Were you concerned, Rhonda said, were you concerned last year when people started receiving mystery seeds from China? I was hoping some agency would step in and try to educate the public on proper disposal to prevent possible invasive species.
I assume that's a question for you, Slade.
Yeah, ask that one again. I make sure I understand the question right. With the seed packets that were delivered.
Yeah, the seed packets that were distributed. Said I was hoping some agency would step in and try to educate the public on proper disposal to prevent possible invasive species. I can simply say from Illinois, our Department of Agriculture and our state plant health director, APHIS PPQ, handled all of the disposal recommendations, and we were able to provide that on communication channels.
Yeah, and that's similar to Wyoming. We worked pretty closely with the Department of Ag. I worked closely with the USDA PPQ to collect all the seed packets we knew about in the state and do outreach. And certainly a lot of concerns about what species were in those packets because no one really knew. So I thought we did as well of an outreach as I think we could have in that short time in Wyoming. Not sure how other states did, but at least with the weed coordinators I talked from other states, sounds like they were kind of in the same boat, and we're working closely with USDA PPQ.
Erica mentioned that USDA APHIS did send out an educational information last year when the seeds from China were arriving.
I was just going to make a comment with respect to the seeds here that just reminded me, because I was also aware of the seeds from China, but I was just, this reminded me that we did not include in our analysis seed-based laws. There's often differences between a noxious weed list and a seed-based law. And Slade, I actually just looked up Wyoming, and our interpretation of what the list is here says no seeds from the following noxious weeds are allowed. So we interpreted that to be a seed law, which maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we didn't include any seed laws. So that's why Wyoming was 0.
Well, we can work on with that, Jacob, but we do have a seed law list, and then we also do have a noxious weed list. So maybe just got somehow crossed with those two. So we'll certainly get that to you.
Got it, thanks.
Excellent. Doug Johnson mentioned, would NISAW be a logical entity to coordinate state NWLs?
Define the NWLs real quick, and maybe I'm not understanding that.
Noxious weed laws, probably.
Noxious weed laws, okay. I get a little bit concerned when we talk about overarching weed laws or coordination on those. Weed laws are so important to local states and local communities and how they're used. Wyoming drives our cost share programs for landowners, whether it's agriculture or rangeland producers. So, I disagree with the idea that we need to coordinate better on them, but we got to be careful in terms of taking away that local control that is needed with those lists and the purpose of why those lists were created. And I hope that answers the question.
Let me just clarify, Mike, that's a great point, Slade. And I think, where we were coming at that from was not to override local independence, but rather as a way, if something's in an adjacent state that has suitable habitat in your state, it seems logical to maybe think about from a prevention standpoint. But of course, you know, I don't. There's never a one size fits all. But it seems to working together would provide some benefits.
Right.
Excellent. Also, get a comment, Slade. Thanks for the background on the WWAP. It seems like a great tool for us to leverage in advocating for stronger support for management. NISAW folks are trying to get the data sharing tool up and running, so more to come on that.
Sure. Yeah, and you know, the one thing I really like about the Western Weed Action Plan, you know, there was a lot of emphasis on the sagebrush biome, but if you really read through that plan, a lot of those action items really deal with the noxious invasive species arena as a whole. And so I think, you know, even if it's a state or an entity that maybe doesn't deal with the sagebrush biome as much, I think they can find a lot of support on what their national or federal needs are within that document.
Another question, has APHIS activity on the federal noxious weed increased or decreased over the last 10 years?
I thought I saw Tony Coop on the list here. He would be the man to ask. My sense from chatting with, if he's not able to speak, would be that it has increased. I think there may be fewer folks. Is he there? There he is. Perfect.
I just allowed him to speak if he wants to unmute himself, Tony.
Sorry to put you on the spot there, Tony. But I saw you were there.
Tony, are you unmuted?
It looks like he's unmuted, but I haven't heard him talk at all yet.
Test.
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry. We have not listed anything since 2011. We have been evaluating species since then, species that we're hoping to propose down the road. But right now we're taking a look at the structure of our federal noxious weed list to find ways that we could improve the overall structure, maybe develop a tiered list. We're also looking at moving the noxious weed list to a web listing, so that way we can make the whole listing process quicker. So right now our policy folks are looking into all of this before we think about listing other things.
All right, thank you, Tony. I appreciate that.
Yep.
We have a lot of good comments right now going on in the chat box, and we're kind of heading up to the 2 o'clock hour, so Central Time. So I want to make sure that I'm respectful of everybody's time. We will capture all the questions and the comments and send them back around to Jacob and to Slade as well, so that you can comment directly to them. I did want to really just talk a little bit about, there was one comment that NISAW's Weed-Free Product Committee is working on and working with many of the eastern states to coordinate and add common species of concern. And so what we've seen today, I think, is real coming together, real interest in sharing out more information broadly and having more coordination. And so this is an opportunity for us to continue this dialogue in the days and the weeks to come. So I want to personally thank Jacob and Slade for joining us today as the 5th and final and fantastic and to NISAW Part 2 series. I have been instructed to show you just a real quick, show my screen. Let me go here. I don't know if it's going to work. This is an opportunity to say thank you. If you are not a member, please feel free to join us. This recording will be on NISAW's YouTube channel. So please, if you have any information, check it out. We will connect directly with Jacob and Slade to find out if we can share out email addresses, because there seems to be a number of inquiries for additional information. So do either one of you want to put your email in the chat box? I think, okay, great. That would be great. Again, I can't thank you enough. Really, truly, really good presentation. It was a pleasure. And with that, it is 2 o'clock, so I think I am going to say goodbye. I hope everybody has a wonderful spring. Look forward to seeing everybody in Missoula in September. And please check out the website for more information.